All right, hey, welcome back. We have talked about the what if possibility of ending the war that could have taken at least another year, year and a half.
And millions of lives.
Both
I mean,
sides.
even if the low end, you're still talking a million dead
Yes,
on both sides.
exactly.
On both
And
sides.
and that's just something I don't think we were ready to deal with. I mean, granted, we didn't know what was going on in a small desert town in the middle of New Mexico, but again, I guess it was just really the only way we could have dealt with the Japanese
I
force.
mean, MacArthur and Nimitz had to make a plan based on what they knew and what they could do.
Exactly.
Now, granted, Admiral King had given Nimitz every boat he could build.
True.
MacArthur had access to more men than we've ever put on uniform ever before or since.
Whew. It's a lot of men.
We had the capability of crushing the Japanese Empire, but the cost would have been, I think, at the low end, 300,000.
And again,
Dead. I'm
yes,
not talking.
right.
That's literally more than died in the war before this point.
Yes.
So we would have doubled our casualties in the space of a year.
We as American citizens were not wanting to have any of that. I don't think many of your generals would want to have that either. Granted, generals are a little crazy when it comes to numbers, but I still don't think they would have been able to say, okay, hey, we're going to do that.
I don't think that would have been something that they could have.
Swallowed.
Well, I kind of wonder sometimes if that's why the numbers were low. They're just like they can't be that high, make them look better.
Yeah, right.
I mean, we all know how that looks. We see it from admin. We see it in schools. We see it in factories. Make the numbers look better. So you change the scale, like that 1/20, 5% of what we suffered on Okinawa per square mile.
No, thank you.
And I'm like, okay, so but even that estimate for the casualties, 300,000.
That's still a lot.
So
That's still a lot. So
yeah,
we actually have had a secret mission going on for many, many years.
since 42,
Early
early
42,
42,
yeah,
really
early
early
42.
42.
Which, of course, in what many people have seen in the history books, was the Manhattan Project, which, of course, as you know, obviously named after that island in New York, not the city in central Kansas, but
Don't tell
look,
them.
yeah, let's not say that. But again,
But that's where the headquarters was. That's how it got its name.
right,
The
exactly.
Manhattan District.
Yes. And so the idea is that we get together a group of people to try and deal with the situation of the atom. Enrico Fermi underneath a squash court in the University of Chicago
Yeah.
had successfully split the atom.
We had the first self-sustaining nuclear fission
Correct.
reaction.
Right.
Not big enough, obviously, to explode.
No,
But this is what the basis of nuclear power is.
exactly.
So
And so we see now the major change, the development. Okay, we see again the Army Corps of Engineers, the research development part of this. Army Corps of Engineers, headed by one Leslie Groves, who he was tasked with trying to find groups of individuals to help with this plan, getting facilities made to harvest.
just a colonel at the time.
Right? Yeah, just
He
weird.
ends up as what, a three-star general.
Yes, he's
But I mean, he is running an organization that spent what, $2 billion,
exactly
21 billion for today.
right. And again, a secret operation that, as you can imagine, we've got spies everywhere.
Yeah, well, that's a
And-
problem too. But
And I mean, that's a problem that we will deal with later, after the war. But right now, we're just like, we have to try and do something as a second resort. Again, beginning of 42, we don't really know what's going on with the war in Europe. We surely have no real intention of what is happening in the war in the Pacific. Things are not looking so good. So now we have to try and find something that is going to be good.
yes, we got to find something that's going to alter the fundamentals of war
Correct.
in our favor. Technology,
Yeah.
and honestly, the Manhattan Project is the beginning of. Everybody talks about putting man on the moon, but really, the Manhattan Project is the beginning of the American belief that you can find a technological answer to any problem.
Exactly. I mean, you may have heard of it. STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The idea of that being into the education system, it starts in the 40s. with the Manhattan Project. It will continue, of course, with the space race of the 1950s and 60s. And, well, yeah, I don't know. We kind of been lax on that over the last couple of decades.
Well, really, you saw it drop out in the 80s and 90s, but that's because that money left the school.
That's true.
The Defense Department wasn't going to subsidize education anymore because we didn't need that many scientists anymore theoretically.
Yeah.
But you see definitely a sagging, I think, in the amount of especially the engineering and math.
Right.
The technology part's I think relatively new comparatively.
Right.
When we say technology, we're meaning computers.
Right. Exactly.
I mean honestly,
the numbers
and
of,
science
of the
is,
computers.
can be anything. It can be biology and stuff like that. And yes,
Sure.
we do stuff there, but the stuff that Manhattan Project is based in engineering and math.
Right.
And Leslie Groves, he's gruff, but he's an engineer of the old school.
Right. You
So
find a solution.
You
to the
find a
problem.
solution. If you don't have a problem, if you have a problem, you go around it. If you can't go around it, you go through it.
Exactly.
And then Oppenheimer, who's not necessarily listed in before the war, listed in the top names in research. He's not one of these lightning bolt genius guys.
No.
He's more I'm going to crunch these numbers until they tell me what I want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And he's really good at people, surprisingly, for a scientist.
Right, because most scientists are going to be introverts. They're going to be dedicated to their work. He's
much more of not just a team player, but a team orchestrator.
There you go.
Whereas a lot of those guys, like Fermi, are used to running their own lab, and they run them like little dictators.
Yep.
They might hate Hitler, but they sure act like him.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And so harnessing this kind of energy, and of course it starts as the Manhattan District, becomes the Manhattan Project.
Right.
Because, Los Alamos gets all the movies.
Sure.
But meanwhile, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, there's places in Ohio that are all part of this project that are building parts, refining uranium.
Yes.
They knew what they needed.
Yes. It's just a matter of putting it all together.
Plutonium and enriched uranium.
Yeah.
Uranium-235 and plutonium.
And but the problem that we find, of course, is how can we put it into a sustainable piece of machinery that is now weaponized.
Transportable.
That's a good point.
That's really
transportable.
We can't have a bomb that weighs 60 tons. And we got to sail it in a boat.
Exactly.
That's not
that doesn't work so
it's gotta
well.
Be droppable.
Right.
It's got to be a bomb.
And so what we eventually do find, and what I have deemed multiple times in my classes, the 3M bomb, which, of course, if you've ever seen what the original Trinity test bomb looked like, it was literally just a big ball of metal.
Yeah,
that was just
surrounded by an iron cage. Yeah.
Yes, and it was duct taped with wires to try and keep it all together.
Maybe that's where they invented duct tape, just to keep that thing together.
Probably so. But the idea, of course, is on July 16, 1945. We have the first official successful detonation of this atom bomb.
I want to say it was May or June that we tested the firing mechanism. It worked perfectly.
Right.
And people, that was the exciting. That was the, now we know we can do this, but we just still don't know what it's going to be like. I mean, some people thought we'd set the atmosphere on fire.
That was the plan. That was really, they were taking bets that morning, that early morning in July of 45 of, okay, well, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to be a dud. Or it's going to completely ignite the whole atmosphere and the whole world's going to go up in flames. Thank goodness that didn't happen.
Yeah, but those are the people, that same people that said the Hadron Collider was going to create a black hole, sucks in the whole Earth.
Yeah, okay. No, it actually has improved quite a few things. But the idea, of course, is now, think about it, we're July of 45. The war in Europe has been over for 2 months now.
Yeah, it's too late to fight Hitler.
True. Well, he's dead and gone and buried, well, burned, but...
Dead, burned, buried, and stuck in a box and headed for the Kremlin.
Right. But the idea, of course, is we still have that massive gorilla on our back, the Japanese.
It just won't go away. And like we talked about last time, when we start looking at downfall,
right,
the whole organization, and we compare it to Ketsugo, this is going to be a long process. But early in 1945, because it looked like success was around the corner. Sure. Now, granted, in science, sometimes around the corner is a decade.
True.
In this case, it was just a few months.
That's a good thing.
They had to start figuring out, what are we going to blow up with this thing?
Yeah.
And we weren't really interested in using it on troops. That didn't seem like a very effective use. So we were like, pick a city. Okay.
So they make a list of 4 cities.
Kokuro, which I had never heard of until this
No,
list.
I never heard of that either.
Hiroshima, we've heard of that one
Yeah,
somewhere.
I think so.
Niigata, which is way up north.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kyoto.
Wow.
But the Secretary of War vetoes Kyoto immediately.
I think that would be a good idea because, of course, Kyoto is,
Palace.
it's
I
a
mean,
religious center.
It's got cultural significance.
We don't want to have that be on our list.
I don't
so.
know if it'd be like for the French losing Paris.
True.
All you're going to do is make them fighting mad,
Yes.
and you're not going to accomplish anything.
Right.
So instead, they put a town called Nagasaki in place of Kyoto.
So
We have a list, and that list doesn't really change. But on that list, that means those cities are spared the firebombing that
That's a good
LeMay
point.
puts in there.
Mhm.
He's firebombing the crap out of everything he can find.
And notice Tokyo is not on that list.
So I got bombed in 40,
and it
early
definitely
45, and it
gets
burned.
Destroyed by many of these.
Estimates of casualties of that are well over 100,000.
With
How much of the city being burned? Because again, you have such paper and wooden
Oh, yeah.
structures.
And of course, again, you've used up so much of your stuff for your military.
Correct.
And we already saw with their ships,
right.
fire control, not the
Not-
shooting fire control,
right.
but the putting out fire,
Right.
damage control,
Yes.
is not a real well thought of activity. Of course, if you're in Japan, by the time the fire department got their truck there, your house is gone because
Yep.
it's paper and wood.
Right. So what we find here now is
A possibility of getting these Japanese to surrender before the initial first.
We don't want to
Wow.
land
no.
if we can. Now, granted, it's still 3 months away.
Right.
I mean, we're not even scheduled to land until November.
Right.
It's early August, but Trinity happens
In July.
In July, while
Truman is at the Potsdam Conference,
Correct.
which is where he tells
Stalin what Stalin already knows
Yep.
is that we have an atomic bomb.
Right.
well, we're working towards an atomic bomb, and now he says we got one.
Yeah.
Stalin already knew because they'd infiltrated the
Heck out of the scientists there.
Mhm.
The Army Corps of Engineers cut some corners in allowing people's brilliant minds in, even if they were heavily socialist or communist,
Sure.
even sometimes full communist.
Mhm.
in their political leanings.
And so it was fairly easy for the Soviet Union to get people in there. But it doesn't really change anything. We still
No.
built the bomb, and the
Right.
Soviet Union doesn't get one for another 2 years. So, haha.
Right.
No, 4 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. 1949 is when
Yeah,
they dropped that first.
4 more years.
Yeah.
So, bleh.
Yeah.
Take that, Joe.
So the problem, of course, is while I don't know. You know what? We're gonna deal with that later. Anyway, Hiroshima. Hiroshima was the first of these targeted cities.
Yes.
August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, that massive
B-29.
B-29 bomber.
Modified.
Right.
Because it had
Oh,
a
yeah.
little bit bigger bomb bag.
Of course. But the initial dropping of the bomb. We are now we're no more nice guy here.
No.
As you'll notice here on the slide, it's a 13 kiloton bomb.
Which is disappointing because the Trinity test was around 20.
Woo.
And so this ended up probably a little lower than the designers wanted.
But I think that
It's enough.
especially when you see some of the percentages, or sorry, the numbers of these people's killed.
Well, 60-some% of the city is destroyed.
Yes.
70 to 80,000 dead.
And that's just the initial death toll.
Although, other than from burns, there's not a lot of others because the bomb is detonated way higher than it should be.
Sure.
Later in the 50s, they figure out the optimal height to drop.
Ah.
Size of the bomb.
It's really cool, by the way. I used to check it out in the library because I'm a total nerd. Little wheel of death. You literally put how much kilotonnage, and it would tell you what would be the optimal, how big would the crater be if you dropped it on the ground, how big the crater would be if you did an airburst,
Oh my
the
goodness.
best airburst altitude.
Wow.
I mean,
That's something.
that's engineering math right there.
Yes, it is. But the thing is that of course when the initial blast took place, 70 to 80,000 dead.
We're talking within 10 minutes.
Yeah. Again,
10 minutes,
I mean,
gone.
some people's within milliseconds they are vaporized,
Well, yeah.
especially closer
It's
to the
burned into
epicenter.
bridges.
Right. Right.
I mean,
Their shadows are
burned into a bridge.
yes. My grandfather, who was in World War II, had talked about the fact that when he went in after the bomb was dropped, his Marine division went in, and they said the smell was just appalling
It's a bunch of burnt people.
yeah, it's gross to see what actually took place. But again, the Japanese are ruthless. They do not give in.
No, the emperor visits either on the 8th or the 9th. I'm not sure which.
Sure,
But it was before.
The next one.
correct.
And he is appalled.
Well,
But
There's no move in the cabinet. Now, granted, we got to remember the emperor is really,
I figured it.
he's basically like the Queen of England was,
Right.
now the King of England.
Right.
They don't really have a lot of power. He has moral suasion is the fancy term. If he says something, people are more likely to listen.
sure.
But so nothing changes.
No, and that's a problem because again, we drop a second bomb, and the second one being August 9, 1945, on
Originally, Kokura was
Right.
the target
right, but we go with Nagasaki.
Because
Kokura is covered in clouds.
Correct. And so we find now this 21 kiloton Fat Man being dropped. Funny names, Little Boy, Fat Man, blah blah blah, whatever the case may be. Little Boy was the uranium bomb, correct?
Yes.
And Fat Man was the plutonium bomb. Now we see less dead initially, 35 to 45,000 initially killed, but again,
Less of the city's destroyed because it's on a mountain.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like this.
yeah,
It wasn't dropped.
It wasn't detonated high enough
right.
to get rid of that.
Right, and so it's kind of it almost sheltered a lot of what the detonation was.
Like a third of the city didn't have hardly any effects.
Right,
Other
which
than
was
it got dark.
right.
That was the thing about Hiroshima. Is a lot of the descriptions, they talk about it being
Basically black. I mean, you can't see anything because the clouds blotting out the sun,
Right.
and they're trying to escape. There's fire everywhere.
Yeah, and you of
And
course it's
a nightmare.
terrible. It's terrible. It's literally hell on earth.
Yes.
Now again, after Little Boy and Fat Man, we are bluffing a little bit
A little.
by saying that we'll have more within.
Well, the Japanese actually believe we might have 100.
Yeah,
Well,
which
that would have been terrifying.
yeah, it would have been. But again, we do see that Leslie Rose is explaining that we will have more by the end of this month, at the end of August,
Well, a little over a week away, you'll have
Yeah.
another bomb going off.
because we have the capabilities. We have the necessary materials, we have the opportunities we needed to get this up and running, and we could have mass produced enough.
Well, 3 a month is the schedule after September.
Sure, and
3 a month.
think about that.
And of course, if you're the emperor and you assume that they're right, and they have 100. That means 100 of your cities are going to be gone.
Yes.
And he's seen Hiroshima.
Yes, he is very reluctant after the second bomb is dropped to say, okay.
Well, he actually is at the cabinet meeting
Mhm.
to make the decision, and he tells the cabinet to surrender, which is unheard of because it's not really his power.
Right. He's kind of an
But-
unspoken leader.
But he tips the scales in the vote of the cabinet.
Right.
Amani, who was the Secretary of War at the time, or Minister of War, whatever you want to call it, for the Japanese, was a serious Bushido, death before
Death
dishonor
before
kind of guy, and which becomes important. And eventually, the vote goes against them, and the decision to accept the Potsdam Declaration, which is unconditional surrender,
Right.
is agreed. And the thing is it was agreed to, and their original, they were really down to bartering for the emperor,
Sure.
and the emperor's like, I don't care.
I just want my people to
I
survive.
would rather be not the emperor. What's the good of being an emperor of a bunch of dead people?
Right.
I mean, honestly,
It makes sense. As much as the stuff that was done in his name, and possibly even with his connivance,
Mm-hmm.
he actually stands up and makes a difference. But I wanted to read this because it was just so fascinating to me. So even after all this, firebombings of the cities, the Soviets have declared war now and have invaded Manchuria. They're just running roughshod over the Japanese.
And they were actually asked by the United States to actually intervene.
Yes, I mean, that's what Harry was doing in Potsdam. He was
Right.
begging them to get in the war.
Right.
But he didn't know when they would get in the war. Sometime in August, either the end of the month or the middle.
Sure.
They went a little early, probably because of the atomic bomb.
Right.
Because I think Stalin probably figured they'd surrender.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, with all this going on, the 2 atomic bombs, and the thought that the United States actually has 100 of these things. The Japanese government actually had a coup on the night of the 14th, so 5 days after Nagasaki. The emperor's already called for them to surrender on August 10th. I think they actually communicated on the 11th or the 12th with the Allies. A bunch of younger officers, so we're talking like majors, colonel,
Lesser, not generals, basically.
No.
actually attempted coup. They actually took over the palace, and they tried to find the recordings of the surrender recording. Of the
So that they could
emperor,
destroy it.
so they could destroy it, so say it never happened. And they thought they would get the generals involved, but the generals, including this Amani, he said, "His Majesty said it. Since it is the decision of His Majesty that we accept the Potsdam Proclamation, there is nothing that can be done.
Right.
If there is anyone here who is dissatisfied and who wishes to act contrary to His Majesty's decision, he will have to do so over my dead body."
Wow.
This is a guy who probably would have literally fought the emperor in the conference room to keep from surrendering,
Right.
but just 5 days later says, "We're done."
We got to do it.
He said that's what's going to happen. And if we believe what we say, we believe about
Fighting for the emperor, we can't do stuff against his will.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest point to me is this last sentence. If a coup was a reaction
To the surrender in mid-August of 45, when the situation has looked far bleaker than at the beginning of the summer, it is safe to assume that any earlier attempts at surrender would have met with stiffer resistance. In other words, no.
they would not have surrendered without the atomic bombs.
Right. There's no doubt.
I just
We've both been privileged enough to go down to the Truman
Oh
Library
my
and
gosh.
see the declassified documents. It is very obvious that Truman spent his entire diplomatic capital getting Joe Stalin into the war
Yes.
during the Potsdam meeting. And that was his push because he didn't want Americans to face all the casualties on their own.
Makes sense.
If this was going to cost another 2 or 3 million lives, he wanted a lot of them to be Russian,
Yeah.
or at least not American.
Well,
I guess
for
that's
sure.
the best way to put it. I mean, you and I have both run into people all over that want to rewrite history and say it was a horrible decision. Well, number one, Harry Truman never made a decision to drop a bomb. It was just embedded in the Manhattan Project from day one that we were going to build a bomb and we were going to use it. You don't build a weapon that costs $2 billion and not use it.
exactly.
That's just not going to happen.
No, it was never a choice.
A demonstration would have done nothing to impress anybody.
No.
Because they didn't surrender after Hiroshima.
No, they had
a vote,
right.
and it didn't change their minds.
So they had to go again. We had to drop a second bomb. Now, of course, people say, well, if we wouldn't have dropped the bomb, so many people would have never lost their lives.
We're looking at total casualties of 150,000.
Yeah.
When we put that against, assuming just combat deaths,
Right.
of 1 million on both sides.
Right.
It's already a 6-to-1 exchange ratio, which almost any military planner would take.
Right. Now, you can say all you want of the fact that, well, with this introduction of the atomic age, we start the creation of the Cold War. It was bound to happen. I feel it was bound to happen.
Well,
The Russians would have all ultimately done what they did.
at the end of the World War II, there were only 2 great powers to survive.
Correct.
I mean, Britain and France won,
Yes,
but they didn't
weren't.
survive. Not
No.
as great powers.
No, of course
They
not.
were large powers, but just not that big.
They were nothing like the United States.
The United States and the Soviet Union were the 2 big dogs on the block,
Correct.
and they were the only ones that were on the block at this
Yes,
point.
exactly.
At Potsdam,
Right.
Churchill, and then Eden,
Mm-hmm.
who, in a twist of fate, the British people literally vote Churchill out of office as he won the war.
So weird.
It's so weird.
But that's
Welcome
just
to parliamentary
right.
democracy.
right. That's politics for you, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, but it was 6 years.
Yeah.
They had to call an election
Yeah. Exactly.
because he got put in 39.
right.
That's the limit according
Yep.
to their rules. But anyway, all the other plans would have involved millions and millions of civilian deaths, of Japanese deaths.
Yes.
So I'm thinking, even as a Japanese person,
150,000 dead in an instant through atomic bombs would have been much better than a 5 to 10 million dying of starvation.
right.
And it ended the war. Starvation might not have ended the war.
Right. And that's the big deal about it. Starvation, death, disease, everything that would go with it makes it more understandable of dropping the atomic bomb.
Yes.
And again, we have to look at it in a 1945 perspective. We can't look at it in a 2023 lens.
Well, we can't look at it even from a 1955 lens
Correct.
because then we're already in the midst of the Cold War. We've got hydrogen bombs now, and
Oh
we're
my
looking
gosh,
at the end of
yes.
the world.
Yes.
This was not going to be the end of the world.
No.
It was barely going to be the end of Japan.
Well, you didn't even have fallout
Right.
after these.
These two bombs were dropped. It is not like what we think of today with our end of the world nuclear weapons that are going to eradicate many species.
Yeah, well, possibly all life on Earth,
Right.
especially at the peak of the war of the 70s,
Right.
the Cold War.
Yes.
Luckily cold.
Yes, thankfully.
But when you look at the alternatives, just on the exchange program alone,
Right.
the number of Chinese dead versus the number of Japanese dead shouldn't have been Japanese dead as opposed to Chinese dead.
Right.
I mean, just that exchange alone, we're talking a war that's going to last at least another year, bare minimum. That's 120,000 Chinese dead
Right.
in exchange for 120,000 Japanese dead.
I think we'll be okay with that.
Fair. I mean,
It's not no death is fair, but
right, especially when we talk about war and we talk about civilians, but that's what we're looking at in China.
Right.
A lot of civilian deaths in China. And of course, if we would have been fighting through Kyushu, especially the heavily populated parts
Correct.
of Kyushu,
correct.
and into the Kanto Plain down into Tokyo and Kyoto and Yokohama,
We would have been destroyed.
I mean,
Those
even
people
if
would
we
have been
would have
gone.
won, the civilian casualties would have been so much more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, people forget this did not happen in a vacuum.
No.
No one sat down and decided on a nice spring day, on summer day,
Right.
and said, you know, I'm going to bomb 2 Japanese cities
No.
and just kill 150,000 people.
No,
Nobody
this was never. It was in the middle.
of a very, very bloody war
Right.
that was looking to get bloodier.
Right.
We were not, I mean, I can remember when I worked in hospice, I met a guy who was in, I want to say it was the first Cavalry. I don't know. He served in Europe, literally
Sure.
from D-Day to the end of the war.
Sure.
He didn't get enough points.
And so
So he was sitting on a beach in San Diego waiting to get shipped out to fight, you know, Kyushu.
Yes.
When he heard about the bomb being dropped and the war ending. And he sat on a beach and cried.
I bet.
and 60,
Well,
70 years later, that still haunted. He was guilty.
that he felt good about those people dying. So don't tell me that we didn't care or that we
Right.
were racist or because we couldn't have dropped it on the Germans.
Well, they were already surrendered by then.
Exactly.
They had surrendered 2 months before we even had a workable prototype. There was no need to drop this bomb on the Germans.
Right.
Would we have?
Had we had that bomb,
Say if the test was done in March, would we have
Sure.
dropped it? Probably not, because their army was collapsing.
right?
We
Sure.
weren't looking at any invasion of a difficult to invade area
They were already giving up by then anyway.
in mass numbers.
Like they were running to our troops because they didn't want to go to the German or to the Russians. But the idea is
It had nothing to do with race. It had
no. It ultimately had to do with the casualty rates.
some fascism that was infesting the Japanese government.
Correct.
One of, again, just like Germany, a fairly liberal democratic government in the 1920s turns into a wildly fascist, militaristic government in the 30s and 40s.
Which leads
Which
to
changes a generation of people into
Yes.
believing they're
their
Yes.
yeah, exactly.
about stuff.
Which left us with no choice either to just literally be drenched in our own blood
Or
drop bombs.
and
Again, but there was there was no real decision. There was no moment where Harry S. Truman sat in his office and said, "Go.
oh, what do I do? What
What
do I
do I
do?
do?
What
Should
do
I
I do?
drop this
No,
bomb?
it was
No.
it was done.
General Groves was taking that bomb
That he had built,
Yes.
because he is an engineer,
Yes.
and he's going to take it to Saipan.
and he's going to put it on a plane and
Yes.
drop it.
himself if he has to.
Yes. There was no turning back after that bomb
Really,
had been.
the bomb was going to be dropped based on a decision made by FDR in 1942 that we
Yes.
were going to build one.
Yes.
Right.
That's really what
That's
it comes
exactly
down to.
it.
The only way it wouldn't have happened is if the war would have ended before they made it.
But we already know that wasn't going to be the case.
Well, I mean, assuming
Okay,
Because
yes,
as long as
sure.
the Soviets,
Sure.
and it wasn't until 1949 we
Right.
got the bomb,
Right.
this would have all been moot.
yes.
Because we'd have an atomic bomb, we just have a whole lot less people.
Yep.
So, As horrible as any decision in war is, and we've talked about this before with Tara,
Correct.
we talked about this in Okinawa,
Right.
we've talked about this in Europe as well.
Right.
The amount of casualties that occur in a war, the person to blame for that is the one who starts the war,
Exactly.
honestly speaking. And that's the only thing. It's why today we have debates about preemptive war.
Right.
When are you justified for starting a war before somebody else starts one because you know they're going to start it? That's a debate for theologians and political scientists. We're just history nerds,
Yes.
And we can look back and say,
Hey, glad they did it.
Yeah, definitely.
I
Well,
vote.
I believe that wraps up our war.
I think
and,
so.
and both the European and the Pacific theater, and thankfully,
We got this opportunity, and hopefully you guys learned some information that you may have not known before. And
I know I did.
yeah, definitely. Looking at the research, we were kind of surprised at some of the things that we learned. But
Like the thing, like we never signed the Geneva Convention
right,
before World War II. We hear about it in all the movies,
right,
but we never signed it.
that's crazy.
Which is why we thought we could use chemical weapons. Well, it's one of the arguments, but
Yeah.
as we talked about, it didn't even get out of committee.
Nope.
So it doesn't matter. It's like saying, well, I'm going to shoot people I don't like. Well, that doesn't mean anything if you don't
No.
even attempt to do it.
Right.
Like you don't go buy a gun.
Yeah, that's true. So anyway, please give us a like, give us a follow, and be on the lookout for some more exciting information regarding historical events.